Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here. Thank you very much to Alison and Gail for inviting me to begin with. It's been really, really good to hear presentations earlier this morning to get a kind of good sense of what's happening on the ground. I'm going to do more of a little bit of a step back and take a kind of broad perspective of tertiary educations across the 4 nations of the UK, and drawing on a very small preliminary findings from a research project that I'm leading at Edge. And I'd like to share some early insights from that project and use this as a space for discussion. So expect to contribute, please. I also want to offer a little bit of a disclaimer. What I'm going to be talking about is very much a perspective. It's an overview of policy and some insights into practice from someone who is outside of that space. So that lens is going to characterize how I'm thinking about this, and I'm also talking to a group of people who know this space. This is where you have your kind of real professional capacities. I am looking at that, taking ideas from it, and then presenting them back to you. And what I'd really like to get from you guys is a sense of, does this make sense? Does it align with your experiences? If it doesn't, I'd really like to know that so I don't look like an idiot when I present this at other places. So in this sense, this kind of talk is part of that research process. So if you can really help me with that, that would be really, really appreciated. So thanks in advance. So what I'm going to do, clicker, there we go. Bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to go through, what does tertiary even mean? Because I don't think it's particularly super clear, actually, what that concept means, particularly in kind of broader policy debates which are prevalent at the moment. I would then kind of give a brief overview of some of the 4 nations' government approaches, which are the kind of new directions that a lot of, particularly Wales, for example, and then Scotland are pursuing. I'm going to talk a little bit then about the research project that I've been working on and how that is looking to kind of inform and what it's trying to do about contributing to that policy discussion. Then there's going to be a couple of sessions of where I'd like to propose some of the findings that I've been working through. You're going to rip them to shreds and tell them I'm an idiot. They are primarily around how collaboration arises in conditions of competition or resource scarcity, and also whether or not collaborations enable distinctive capacities. And hopefully that will facilitate some discussion around motivations, data, shared cultures, some of these ideas we've already talked about. It'd be really good to kind of get your reflections on those. So, starting, what is tertiary? And as I kind of pointed to, there is actually a surprising degree of, I was going to say nebuliness. I don't think that's a word. Nebularity around what tertiary actually is. The Bologna framework describes it as basically any education which is post-16, so that is further vocational, professional, and higher education. But its meaning has evolved and taken on new connotations in the current policy landscape, and it's generally associated now with visions of unitary governance. So that is the governance of further higher, all of these kind of broad post-16 education systems under one single governance framework. This model is contrasted with siloed structures in traditional binary models, such as that of England, which separate particularly FE and HE in terms of funding, oversight, and mission. And that divide between FE and HE is what I'm primarily going to be concentrating on today. The advocates of these kind of tertiary ecology models, are advocated people like Ellen Hazencorn, talk about this a lot, are intended to promote institutional flexibility, networked collaboration, and alignment with stated public and common goods. The coordinated systems are intended to be responsive to local and global socioeconomic needs, and this includes features like widening participation, lifelong learning, and credit transferability. There are examples of tertiary system prominently, for example, in New Zealand, Norway, and Wales, which I'll speak about a little bit shortly. And these models formalize competition. Incorrect. I told you. Formalize cooperation, enabling a level playing field amongst stakeholders to co-design priorities and allocate resources. And as well as this kind of government level tertiary approach, there are other developments where institutions have started taking on collaborative structures to bridge those traditional HE-FE divides. And these range from arm's length validation agreements through to franchising, all the way across articulation partnerships to ad hoc mapping of particular courses, and then fully integrated partnerships where, for example, two institutions, an FE college, HE college, or some sort of other combination, are part of the same legal entity. And I've kind of already hinted at this, but the devolution of powers after 1998 in the UK has led to different approaches in coordinating the tertiary sector across the UK. And what this means is it's created a kind of policy laboratory where different mixes of social partnerships and specific ideas about national needs and context produce unique approaches to tackling some common challenges. And there are really interesting opportunities to kind of speak to some of these themes as to how institutions can best collaborate, and also ways that we might want governance to be influenced in order to facilitate those kind of developments. So I'm going to run through very quickly, hopefully none of this is too new for you guys, but what the kind of tertiary landscape across the four nations looks like. So Scotland, of course, very familiar, I think, to most people here, so I won't dwell on it too much. It's a system-based approach, which is compared to, for example, England, which is much more fragmented, with one body responsible for funding colleges and universities. A number of reports, including the Comerford and Little 2020 report, SSC and Withers, have urged government to go further in establishing a coherent and strategic tertiary system. And in February this year, there was a bill introduced to make the SFC responsible for providing national training programs and apprenticeships, taking on that from Skills Development Scotland. And there are a wide variety of FE and HE collaborations of the sort that I was primarily interested in this research, which we've already heard about this morning, but also includes the kind of broad structure of articulation agreements, et cetera, et cetera. Wales has gone much further than any other nation in the UK towards a tertiary system, and in many ways it's world leading, with its new Commission for Tertiary Education and Research, which Medr, skills in Welsh. It's now responsible for further education, higher education, adult education, apprenticeships, and training. And this means that Wales is the first UK nation to have a single body responsible for the entire tertiary sector. Its mission statement is intended to act as a steward for the whole of the sector, responsible for planning, delivering, and funding a strategy for post-compulsory education in space which is designed to be in partnership with providers and learners. And this includes promoting strategic duties in, for example, equality of opportunity, participation, sustainability, civic mission, and Welsh ministers' statements of priorities. And this is all aligned with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act Wales 2015, which requires Welsh public bodies to consider the long-term impact of their decisions, foster collaboration, and address persistent challenges like poverty, health inequalities, and climate change. Northern Ireland I know the least about. Does anyone know more about Northern Ireland? Because I'm really struggling to find sources. If anyone knows any good contacts in Northern Ireland, please let me know. So there's a strong culture of collaboration in Northern Ireland. There's a lot of higher education delivered in further education colleges, and there have been calls to collaboratively design high-level vocational courses with articulation into degree courses to be delivered locally at colleges. And without a stable executive, there has been progress has been slow from what I understand. Unlike elsewhere in the UK, in Northern Ireland, the Department of the Economy directly allocates to universities and colleges, though within that, the two sectors of FE and HE have been treated as separate silos. The most prominent recent development has been the development of these curriculum hubs across these 6 regional colleges in Northern Ireland, where each one of the regional colleges takes on responsibility for a particular occupational area and works with other colleges to ensure that this priority has been developed as a kind of consort throughout that structure. And there was a review in 2023 which recommended that the regional colleges be brought together into a single college, national college government. governance model to facilitate a kind of broad overall strategy, but with increased freedoms for colleges to intervene at a local level according to their observation of local needs. In England, different scale. It exemplifies a market-based system with fragmented governance and accountability, with clear divides between higher education, regulated by the Office for Students primarily, and further education overseen by ESFA and Ofsted. This has been criticised as being detrimental to collaboration and for the holistic oversight and aims and direction of the system in England, but I think it's really important to recognise that this was the deliberate decision of the implementation of a marketised system from the 1990s. The kind of idea of marketisation was a response to what it was seen as the weakness of planned systems and that sort of oversight. So, for example, in 2017, Minister for State for Universities and Science, Joe Johnson, put it that without competition, universities in particular acted as a cartel, conspiring to defend their state revenue streams from potentially more innovative and responsive new providers. And I think he would probably have extended that to talk about the ways that colleges can be seen as monopolizing the straight revenue streams that they he would put it, have claim to those sorts of spaces. But it can also be argued that those sorts of the cultivation of competition in that way to drive innovation is no less wasteful. Responding to what are competitive, homogenizing, and wasteful market government regimes in England, the policy rhetoric had advanced the possibility of a more rationalized, collaborative system of tertiary education in England. And there are signs that with the instigation of Skills England and the Lifelong Learning Entitlement from 2026, which it aims to unite the loan system across HE and FE, that there might be a way for a tertiary system to emerge in England as well. There are a handful of initiatives which have been promoted to cultivate forms of tertiary collaboration even within this marketised system, most prominent of which are the 13 Institutes of Technology, introduced in 2019, and subsequently some others emerged as well. And they are intended to be collaborations between FE colleges, universities, and employers, which specialise in delivering higher technological education. The capacity of these sorts of unitary tertiary governance bodies to make strategic decisions about their localities has directly grown, well, it's grown in consortium with calls for broader regionalisation and devolution to the English regions. And this is particularly the combined mayoral authorities in places such as Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, and London, who might be able to use that, again, to be able to address specific local skills needs and economic priorities. Before we go too much further in getting too excited, there is some caution that the literature that I've identified in the literature, and the research literature in particular, there is a sense that most of the debate around the tertiary systems has prioritised the political discussion as the mechanisms and scope, rather than actually how it occurs on the ground. How far collaboration in existing systems changes institutions' strategic capacities and learner outcomes remains under-examined, from a research perspective anyway. Existing literature has indicated that tertiary collaboration can be furthered as a response to the rationalisation of resources. International evidence has warned that this rationalisation may erode colleges' localism, and there is doubt as to how far collaboration actually contributes to widening participation, for example, and that particularly from the Australian context. Prescriptive unitary funding and quality regimes may persist in ensuring that certain perspectives about what quality means, or, for example, domineering university interests, might restrict educational innovation. Knowledge of student outcomes, and I said that before, are afforded our knowledge of what actually student outcomes, how they change when these systems are implemented, what's unique about them, again, it is limited. So, understanding the nature of existing collaboration, understanding the nature of what we might hope to achieve through collaboration, the sort of implements in policy that we use to develop that, it is important to understand where we might be going and how we can ensure that what we're doing is going to be best for students. and staff, as we've already heard. So one of the things that I was keen to do in a research piece was start thinking about, how might we learn about this? What could we be doing to be able to plug some of those knowledge gaps? On the limited amount of resources that I had available, I developed a very, very limited empirical research project, which was interested in, again, a small part of tertiary collaboration, which I started calling progression pathways between HE colleges and FE institutions, which is, they are formal, designed pathways. They are not the incidental movements of students when they are choosing. They are deliberate and intentional. Just so I could get a sense of, if we were pursuing this with intentionality, where might it go? What does it look like? And also in this research, I ended up focusing just on Scotland and England for reasons which will become clear in a bit. And in this talk, I'm going to prioritize talking about two of the interesting findings that I came from two elements of the research questions, which were, first of all, do partnerships provide distinctive opportunities for students? What changes for students? Do they just pursue a normal course and go through and nothing's changed? Or are there unique things that come through and emerge spontaneously through these sorts of partnerships? And the second is, what motivates institutions to establish these partnerships in the first place? So, 17 qualitative interviews, which produced quite a lot of data. These were mainly staff from 11 institutions, including IOTs in England and various institutions across Scotland and England. I wanted student participation. I think we've discussed this already, or certainly I have when I've been talking to people. It was really, really difficult to get students to engage and discuss. I reached out to 75 providers and got... it was very, very difficult to be able to use those contacts to snowball for reasons which are perhaps worth discussing. And then obviously there was supplementary documentary research, which I carried on alongside this. And this sample size means that what I'm going to talk about today is primarily indicative. It is absolutely not representative, and therefore needs to be treated with caution. But I'm hoping that together with a kind of documentary analysis, the findings from the research are useful aids to stimulate perspectives and consideration for policy discussion, but also future research. So, first sort of little section. What are the providers' motivations to collaborate, to develop these kind of formal participation pathways that I was interested in between FEs, colleges, and HE institutions? I'm only going to explore one little bit of what I found, but I hope this kind of raises broader discussions about these motivations that can flesh this out. So this is a little bit of a provocation. And when I was thinking about this, I was reading a completely different book, and I've always I've admired when someone is giving a talk and they just go off completely on a tangent which seems completely unrelated. And this book really helped me think about this stuff. So I'm going to try a completely off-the-wall metaphor and see if it lands. I hope it lands. Lichen. Hopefully people know what a lichen is. That is a lichen. They appear on sort of old wood and stones, and they are, when they were first being scientifically described, were very, very confusing for scientists who were working in the idea that there would be, a species would be a unique and distinct entity. Lichens are a hybrid colony of algae and fungus living symbiotically, and the word symbiotically actually derives, this is what it was used to first describe. And they are the poster child for ecologies, so how different organisms can come together to provide ways which look altruistic. But I think it's really interesting in this book that I was reading was talking about how actually it's not just that these things arise organically. They occur in particular circumstances where each partner has to be able to do something else that the other can't do alone. And they also arise in conditions too severe for either partner to survive alone. So I want to take that really stretched metaphor forwards and see if it helps. So, one of the things that I found really interesting while I was kind of working through the kind of limited study that I had was thinking about how much existing collaboration between institutions is shaped by shared experiences of resource scarcity. And this scarcity is evident both in Scottish system and the English system, despite their differing approaches to resource allocation and distribution, whether in that system-led or market-led circumstance. Hewitt Keep, for example, puts it like, even in countries where there is a systems-based approach is dominant, such as in Scotland, institutions are sometimes competing for scarce funding, students, and prestige. In other words, inside systems, there is often an element of contestability and competition. And while collaboration was much more widespread in Scotland, I think, as you'd probably imagine, and the types of partnerships I was particularly able to talk to were much more forthcoming in terms of speaking to me, which I think is indicative itself. It was also the underlying motivations between the different types of partnership were broadly similar across both systems. From the university side, there was clear use of collaboration as a strategy to kind of grow your own student demand. And it was interesting when Luke was talking earlier, he spoke about the selfishness of engaging in a partnership. And I think that's actually quite fundamental. This applied both to integrated and non-integrated partnerships and was particularly valued where competition for student numbers and student funding consequently was acute. Conversely, institutions with strong market appeal were seen as less inclined to engage in collaborative initiatives, particularly, for example, articulation routes. But I think there is an interesting kind of takeaway from the turnaround from this, is that colleges could in turn use this dynamic to their advantage. As one interview put it, I will say, your numbers are dropping, let us help you fill those spaces. And collaboration, for example, allowed access to new markets, both for universities and colleges. As one interview described, together we broke a barrier that historically they had never managed to break in accessing a college that would never have been interested in engaging with a university like it before. In some cases, collaboration helped to avoid direct competition for the same student cohorts. For example, one interviewee told me about they were introducing a new course which risked placing the university in direct competition with a college partner. In response, the senior university leadership team promised to monitor applications and ensure the course was attracting students from outside the region and from international markets. And they committed to review the situation and review the stance accordingly. As the interviewee summarized, this was just about monitoring and being open and honest about what plans were. And this trust as a kind of element, I think, was the second really important focus of successful and sustained partnerships. One large university, for example, expressed concern about their college partners perceiving them as encroaching on their territory. We don't want the university to be seen as coming in and taking their chips. Our message is always, we want the same thing. Successful collaboration in general was seen to depend on shared institutional cultures and aligned priorities, particularly in relation, for example, to data sharing agreements, which I don't have time to get into too much, but I think were really important, and we've already heard the importance of data today. And Nicola also was talking about the kind of importance of a common language over institutions, which I think is conducive to that sort of things. And if part of that culture, and I think also really, really important for these motivations, was that widening participation agenda. But I think it's also really important to note that this was a shared motivation which was not in tension with the strategic aim of generating student demand. Most of those who discussed a kind of grow your own approach model did not advocate for closed systems. Rather, they saw themselves as offering local opportunities to students who might not wish to relocate, while recognizing that some learners would understandably look elsewhere. At least one interview, however, suggested they would question why a student might choose a different local provider offering a similar course if they didn't attend their university. And I thought it was interesting, we had a brief mention of a lifelong learning entitlement in England, and that might be facilitative of developing partnerships. But I think there was quite a lot of concern in the institution, representatives of institutions that I spoke to, that would provide universities with an incentive to enter markets that have traditionally been used by colleges in particular, and disrupt those markets. And particularly as we've heard, universities seek to diversify their income streams, there might be a shift in incentives which place pressure on collaborative relationships. So I wondered whether we might, at this stage, have a 10-minute discussion in the kind of cabaret tables. There are a couple of questions that I think it would be good to kind of... Oh, that's a summary slide as well. Yeah, we've talked about that already. Move on, because I want to hear from you guys. So perhaps in your tables, if you take one of the questions that looks most exciting from the board. So, what motivations in your experience do providers have for engaging in these sorts of tertiary collaborations? There's a question of this kind of idea of competition and collaboration, collaboration and competition. Is it helpful? Is it provocative? Is it interesting? Is it obvious? Because that was one of the things I was worried about as well. Is this just really obvious? Thirdly, what fosters or inhibits relationships between FE and HE in your experience? And then any kind of general further questions as well would be really, really helpful. So I think, how much time do we have? Oh, perfect. Let's say we'll have about precisely 8 minutes, and then some discussion going on then. Fabulous. I'm going to shut up. Please talk to each other. Okay, and we're back in the room. Could I have some volunteers from one of the tables to just kind of feedback something that they've discussed there? That would be really, really good. We have a hand. Yes, please. I can run. Is this thing on?
Hello. We focused on question 3, so what fosters or inhibits relationships between FE and HE partners, and one of the inhibiting factors that we discussed was the staff attitude towards quote-unquote status of college versus university, where some higher education staff might be totally up for collaborating with colleges and just see it as a part of one big education system, but other staff might be holding on to outdated ideas about the perceived sort of lower status of college versus university education, and that can really harm partnerships and the whole relationship between different institutions.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any? I think yes, I agree. I'm really just keen to. Has anyone else got any? Anyone else want to contribute? Yes.
Hi there. Yeah, we were also considering question 3, and we came up with a few issues. Actually, quite a few similarities. So parity of esteem came up as a critical issue. I think we also thought about, there's probably misconceptions as well about the experience within college and within university. And in some cases, there actually are differences in experience between colleges and universities. And I think also at times there can be, it's about the portability of the qualification. So depends on the qualification, but whether full credit is achieved for the qualification that's been achieved in the receiving institution. So these were some of the things that we talked about.
Fantastic, thank you so much. We could probably have one more. Go ahead. I can run.
So we discussed question 1 and 2, and we said that one of the main motivations for higher education institutions, universities, is generally just trying to, particularly with associate student schemes, is trying to fill places where they're not able to recruit generally, right? So like it's the economy, stupid kind of thing. In relation to question 2, we talked about competition and collaboration and said that it is often very competitive and that universities don't generally have many problems with taking students from colleges, for example, where there's not an HND or an HND is maybe a little bit sugary, they'll happily just offer year 2 entry for those students and then that gets mainstreamed and so on and so forth. But where it's kind of turned on its head is where there's either a vulnerability because of the economy or a vulnerability that's like kind of put into place through policy for the universities. So one example is that was given at our table was about a university in the northeast of Scotland. I won't name names, but was the university was having some difficulties filling halls, but also difficulties meeting the proportion of SIMD 20 students that are expected to meet as part of the Scottish Government target. And so they are then offering very, very good deals to college students, such as free halls for up to 2 years, as part of an associate student scheme that they would never do otherwise, because it's helping them fulfil their expectations. So yeah, they need to be economically vulnerable and kind of vulnerable to policy to be able to do so too.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. In the interests of time, I'm going to move on to the kind of second element of collaboration that I wanted to talk about, which is around to what extent are novel strategic directions and governance models conducive to distinctive provision? And this was, when I was conducting these interviews, this question was either I phrased it really, really badly, or it was a sticking point for people who are answering the question. But the main thing I want to prioritize is thinking about, does anything change for the students that are in these pathways? And again, thinking back to those lichen, do those partnerships offer anything that those partners couldn't do individually? See, it wasn't diversionary. It was a real metaphor. It was really good. So there was a really cautious agreement across the interviews that student outcomes and achievements that were resulting from these collaborations had some distinctiveness to them. For universities in particular, the partnership model helped them to reach different types of learners who would otherwise not have been able to access those programs, which we literally just talked about. And this kind of disruption was framed as positively. It was clarifying and reinforcing their social mission, as this interviewee talked about. I think certainly in terms of whether there is just something distinctive going on here in distinctions in course experience, one advantage that partnerships were able to offer was the ability to provide learners with a more gentle introduction to higher education, deriving from their distinct, and it's actually thinking about the previous speaker, the kind of benefits of having that kind of specialized pedagogy for different purposes and different target audiences, if we want to use that kind of language, which I'm not sure if we do. Smaller class sizes, less intensive assessments, and supplementary support, particularly where articulation mapping had identified prior learning gaps, all helped in this regard, providing that kind of tailored support. And there are examples particularly of shared resources, including campuses, student support services, CPD for staff. In most cases, these arrangements primarily enhanced what was available for FE colleges, but in a few notable and I think really important instances that came up in the research, FE specialisms contributed to teaching provision within higher education institutions. So you got this really valuable two-way street, which I think is one of the advantages of these collaborations, which really needs to be championed, addressing some of that parity of esteem stuff, that you're talking about different degrees of specialism and different areas of specialism rather than distinctions in class or sort. And if you have different examples of that you'd be willing to share with me, I'd really, really be keen to hear that. There was also a sense that these partnerships produced genuinely distinctive outcomes. Interviewees often noted improved retention, and in some cases slightly better achievement when compared to mainstream undergraduates. One interviewee, I think this was in England, pointed out that this would probably reflect the comparatively high levels of investment in higher education students, particularly in collaborative contexts as compared to further education. That said, though, there's also this sense that this improvement might be attributable to the type of learner who is engaging in these partnerships, those who might have clearer and goals and distinct intrinsic motivations, and the guidance that they could therefore receive and pursue through these kind of structured pathways. Having said all of that, one of the most consistent themes across all the interviews was a sense of caution in making claims about the distinctiveness of provision and outcomes, based on anything more than a kind of informed judgment. I have called it anecdotal, but I'm not sure whether or not it's actually fair to call it anecdotal, because these were professionals drawing on their deep knowledge of what they do and their experience, but there is clearly a lack of evaluative and robust data. Some data sources do exist. For example, the two talked about there are UCAS and the National Articulation Database, but these are often too imprecise for institutional level insights or suffer from significant time lag, for example, 3 or 4 years to be able to make interventions immediately. And this creates difficulties in evidencing the distinctiveness of these sorts of partnerships, assessing their impact, or making the case for a return on investment. And I think this kind of lack of data, I also kind of mentioned this before, and we talked about failure earlier as well, and this was one of the real kind of big failures of this project, was a real difficulty in recruiting students to talk to these kind of questions. I think there's also, on the one hand, there's difficulty in actually accessing the students. On the other hand, students are over-surveyed. The amount of the breadth and depth that they are being, essentially investigated, and add on assessment points. It's a lot. And I think there needs to be a kind of conversation about actually how you evidence this and evaluate this without providing and overloading students by demanding, with all the other difficulties that are occurring through their experience at the moment. So, as some kind of overview of the findings, yep, are they distinctive? Cautious agreement. But again, there are opportunities available for students that would otherwise not be available, and I think I may have skipped that, but there's obviously, with the widening participation angle as well, there is some element of distinctiveness in that the students who are participating would not have had the opportunity otherwise without some of these partnerships. But again, how do you evidence this? How do we describe this? In a way which is going to be digestible and acceptable to policymakers as well. So, final bit of discussion. I believe we will have... Fantastic. 7 minutes. 3 questions, and please choose or riff on them as you like. In your experience, does tertiary collaboration lead to distinctive student experiences and outcomes? Are existing data systems adequate to evaluate the outcomes of tertiary collaborations? And I think add to that, what else could we be doing? And are there other elements of collaboration that afford distinctive opportunities for universities, for further education colleges, or their other partners? And thinking perhaps about the collaborative and mutual benefits that are obtained, but also perhaps if there are any trade-offs. Sound okay? Yeah? Okay, let's go. Okay. Where is the mic gone? Did I leave it over there? Okay, does anybody, particularly if a table has not spoken yet, I would like to hear more. Contributions, please. Does anyone would like to say something? Yes, thank you.
So we said in terms of one that yes, there are examples where it leads to distinctive experiences and outcomes. We talked about, for example, in Dumfries, we've now got students doing degree programmes in our college site that just they would not have done before, so that is quite different. And then we talked about particular instances that, particularly have a big impact around widening access into certain subjects. One of our questions was, though, how many of those experiences are systematic and intentional versus how many of them happen just because of the connection of two particular people across institutions or things like that. In terms of the data, the answer is no, and that the data systems are completely inadequate is what we would say. So that would be a summary. I think that was it.
Thank you. I think that's, fairly comprehensive. Any other comments from anyone else, please? Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we discussed number 2, and we were talking about whether the data systems are adequate. A couple of things came up. We were talking about students being surveyed to death, and that whole concept of how do you get data back from students without exhausting them, how do you even get them to contribute in the first place, and how important it was to close the feedback loop and let them know. I think there are some, I'm with the Glasgow School of Art, there are some areas of the Glasgow School of Art that are really good at feeding things back to students very quickly. Our library service is really good at that. And I think, we spoke about how that is so important for students, but then also about how important it is for HE institutions to collaborate on data or to make their data available cross institution, or how good that would be in terms of being able to figure out things like figure out whether there are distinctive student experiences and outcomes for people who come straight into HE from somewhere else rather than your same institution or, other things like that. So some interesting thoughts over here.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, we talked about the, I think in my head, I just couldn't figure out how do you actually measure distinctive student experiences and outcomes. So in many ways, it's like you almost have to track those specific students who are benefiting from the collaborations and nothing else. But then how would you track that? And then suddenly in my head came the documentary about the babies. Yep.
Capturing
the data periodically.
Thank you so much. Any further on those particular questions, or we can kind of open it up more broadly, I think. Should we've got, 5 minutes? Less? 2 minutes? 5 minutes. I guess, any further questions or comments?
Just a question about your research, having studied 4 areas of the UK. Did the issue of rurality and remoteness emerge since Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales and England, in that order, have very differing experiences of providing tertiary education? And having worked in 3 out of the 4 countries, I can see some elements, but I'm surprised that hasn't emerged, because that has a direct impact on our potential and possibility to collaborate, even with the advances in technology.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that I would say as an umbrella kind of thing, whether rurality, whether urbanity is the kind of characterization of the regions which these partnerships found themselves in was really important to the kind of shapes that they took. I think in terms of rurality, you are thinking about regional partnerships which are based in the same sort of space, being most closely aligned in terms of local socioeconomic needs, local industries and things like that. That was particularly, I think, conducive to particular forms of relationship and particular clear cultures which facilitated those relationships. But I think there's also the flip side of that, which is the kind of relationships which are emerging in urban areas as well, which had almost kind of similar problems in that you are often develop, it's areas of deprivation, it's areas where provision is not necessarily tailored to certain sectors, and the focus was around how do you prioritize providing for those spaces in ways which are utilizing those college connections, utilizing those localities in the sense of like community embeddedness rather than necessarily localities in a geographical sense. So I think that kind of broad sort of place-based element of collaboration did come up really, really strongly. I think just within the space that I've had there, I've not been able to focus on it too much, but yes, definitely. Final questions, or we can finish early? We're even early, probably on time, right? I'm bang on time. Fabulous then. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.